In December of the year 2025, in Wagadugu, a delegation led by Reverend Al Sharpton appeared before the cameras with the goal of discussing cooperation and reconciliation between Africa and the West. The presence of Tucker Carlson immediately turned the event into a focal point of international media attention. At the center of the meeting stood President Ibrahim Traoré, young, composed, and not bound by a Western lens of interpretation. He represents a new generation of African leadership, willing to speak plainly and no longer asking permission to be heard. For middle-aged American audiences, this moment carried particular significance. Not loud, not theatrical, but signaling a quiet shift, a conversation the West has avoided for many years. Then, unexpectedly, the discussion took a different turn, moving away from politics. What happens when an African leader challenges belief rather than power? And what happens when he asks a question the West has never been ready to confront? If you truly want to understand the answer, stay with us. Before the conversation took its unexpected turn, everything about the interview followed a familiar rhythm, one that American viewers had seen many times before. Tucker Carlson opened with questions that reflected how the West has long framed Africa: instability, coups, foreign influence, and the fear of chaos. From the perspective of American media, Burkina Faso had often been reduced to headlines about military takeovers and insecurity. This interview, at least at first, seemed destined to follow the same path. Carlson began by addressing Ibrahim Traoré as the youngest head of state on the African continent. The question carried both curiosity and skepticism. How does a man so young hold power in a region shaped by decades of political turbulence? How does one justify a military transition of authority in a world that claims to value democracy above all else? Traoré did not rush his response. He spoke calmly, without defensiveness, and without the emotional tone Western audiences often expect from leaders portrayed as radical or unstable. He explained that Burkina Faso's situation could not be understood through imported political templates. For decades, he said, decisions affecting African nations were made elsewhere, justified in the language of stability while producing dependency. What appeared to the outside world as sudden upheaval was, to many citizens, the result of long-standing frustration. He emphasized sovereignty repeatedly, not as a slogan, but as a principle. Burkina Faso, Traoré stated, was not rejecting dialogue with the West, nor was it declaring hostility toward Europe or the United States. Instead, it was rejecting guidance that arrived with conditions attached. In his view, partnership without respect was not partnership at all. Carlson pressed further, raising concerns familiar to American audiences: security cooperation, counter-terrorism efforts, and the role of former colonial powers. He asked whether breaking away from traditional Western alliances risked isolating Burkina Faso on the global stage. The question reflected a deeply rooted assumption in American foreign policy thinking that legitimacy flows from alignment with Western institutions. Traoré's response challenged that assumption without confrontation. He spoke of dignity before alignment. He reminded viewers that Africa did not exist to balance the geopolitical anxieties of others. The primary responsibility of any leader, he said, was to their people, not to foreign approval. Burkina Faso's choices, controversial as they may appear abroad, were framed as attempts to restore control over national destiny. Throughout this exchange, the atmosphere remained composed and professional. Carlson listened carefully, occasionally nodding, occasionally interjecting with clarifying questions. From a production standpoint, this was still a conventional interview. African news networks later described this segment as measured and diplomatic, while American commentators noted the absence of hostility that often characterizes conversations about African military governments. For viewers over 40 in the United States, the exchange likely felt familiar. It echoed past interviews with leaders from regions labeled as strategic, where sovereignty and security are discussed in abstract terms. Yet something subtle was already shifting. Traoré was not performing for Western validation. He was not attempting to reassure markets or appeal to foreign donors. His tone suggested confidence rather than defiance. At one point, Carlson asked whether Ibrahim Traoré saw himself as part of a broader African revolutionary tradition. Traoré answered carefully. He rejected romantic labels, saying he was not interested in symbolism for its own sake. What mattered, he argued, was whether policies produced dignity, education, and opportunity for ordinary citizens in Burkina Faso. Revolutions that failed to deliver material justice, he implied, were merely performances. This exchange set the emotional baseline of the interview. Calm, serious, predictable. The audience could reasonably assume the discussion would continue along these lines, touching on economics, regional security, and international relations. Nothing in Traoré's demeanor suggested confrontation. Nothing in Carlson's questions hinted at discomfort. And yet, beneath the surface, the groundwork had been laid. By asserting sovereignty as a moral principle rather than a tactical choice, Ibrahim Traoré had already reframed the conversation. He was no longer answering questions within a Western narrative. He was quietly preparing to challenge the narrative itself. That challenge would not come through politics or military strategy. It would come through a subject far more sensitive, far more personal, and far more unsettling for a Western audience than any discussion of coups or alliances. But that was only the beginning of what would soon become impossible to ignore. The turning point did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It arrived quietly, almost respectfully, and that was precisely why it unsettled everyone in the room. After answering a final question about regional security, Ibrahim Traoré paused. The cameras kept rolling. Tucker Carlson prepared to move on, assuming the conversation would continue along familiar lines. Instead, Traoré leaned forward slightly, his posture calm, his expression composed. For the first time in the interview, he was no longer responding, he was initiating. He looked directly at Carlson and spoke with deliberate clarity. "Mr. Carlson," he said, "you are a Christian man. You speak often about faith and moral values, so I would like to ask you something in return. Do you believe that the Catholic Church, as it operates today, is truly on the right path here in Africa?" For a brief moment, the studio fell silent. This was not a hostile challenge. It was not framed as an accusation. It was a question rooted in conscience rather than politics. Yet its weight was unmistakable. Africa news commentators would later describe this moment as the instant when the interview stopped being a media event and became a moral confrontation. Carlson did not interrupt. He did not deflect. Instead, he took a breath, visibly recalibrating. For an American audience over 40, this hesitation mattered. It signaled that something unexpected had occurred. The usual power dynamic of interviewer and subject had dissolved. Carlson responded cautiously. He acknowledged the historical presence of Catholic institutions across Africa. He spoke of schools that had educated generations of children, hospitals that served the poor, and missionaries who devoted their lives to service. In several African countries, he noted, Catholic schools accounted for a significant share of non-state education, while Catholic health networks formed the backbone of rural medical care. These were not insignificant contributions. He emphasized that many priests and nuns stood alongside marginalized communities, sometimes at great personal risk. Corruption, Carlson said, was not inherent to faith itself, and millions of Africans, including many in Burkina Faso, practiced Christianity sincerely and voluntarily. "I think it would be dishonest to deny that Catholic institutions have helped millions of people," Carlson concluded. Traoré listened attentively. He did not interrupt. He did not react emotionally. When Carlson finished, Traoré nodded slowly, acknowledging the points made. There was no attempt to negate the good that had been described. Instead, he took the conversation deeper. "I do not deny any of that," Traoré replied. "But help does not erase history, and faith should never be used to silence questions." What followed was the emotional and intellectual climax of the interview. Traoré made it clear that his concern was not Jesus Christ, nor the spiritual beliefs of ordinary Africans. His concern was power, institutional power, historical power, and the way that power had often been intertwined with colonial domination across Africa, including Burkina Faso. He spoke slowly, almost methodically, as if presenting a historical record rather than an opinion. The room remained silent as he transitioned from diplomacy into moral reckoning. This was no longer about Western alliances or military transitions. It was about how belief systems, when fused with authority, could shape generations. For American viewers, this moment demanded attention. Faith occupies a central place in American identity, particularly among older generations. To hear an African leader speak not against Christianity, but against the misuse of religion as control, forced a reconsideration of long-held assumptions. Carlson did not interrupt again. He did not attempt to reclaim control of the interview. Instead, he listened. In that silence, the balance of the conversation shifted permanently. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer responding to Western curiosity. He was inviting the West to confront its own contradictions. And as the interview moved forward, it became clear that this question was only the doorway. What followed would be far more difficult to dismiss. As Ibrahim Traoré continued, the discussion moved beyond theology and into lived reality. What he outlined was not an abstract critique of doctrine, but a series of civil and political consequences that, in his view, ordinary people across Africa had carried for generations. This was where the conversation grew heavier, not because of accusation, but because of implication. Traoré explained that in many parts of Africa, including Burkina Faso, religious institutions had not existed in isolation from political authority. During the colonial era, missionary expansion often moved alongside imperial administration. Churches arrived before schools, and schools arrived before borders were drawn. Faith, education, and governance became intertwined in ways that shaped identity itself. For many Africans, he said, belief was introduced alongside submission. He described how indigenous customs and spiritual practices were frequently labeled as backward or sinful. Languages that carried ancestral memory were replaced by Latin, French, or Portuguese. This was not merely cultural loss, it was a restructuring of self-worth. When people are taught that their traditions are inferior, they are easier to govern, easier to extract from, and easier to silence. Traoré's tone remained controlled, but the weight of his words was unmistakable. He acknowledged that not every priest or missionary participated in these dynamics. Some resisted, some protected local communities. But systems, he emphasized, are not judged by their exceptions, they are judged by their patterns. He then addressed the issue of authority within global religious institutions. Decisions affecting African congregations were often made thousands of miles away, in places with little understanding of local realities. Financial assets, land ownership, schools, and hospitals operated under structures that were difficult to audit and nearly impossible for local communities to challenge. This lack of transparency, Traoré argued, weakened trust and reinforced dependency. From there, the discussion shifted to modern consequences. Traoré referenced widely reported scandals involving clergy abuse in several African countries. These cases, documented by international media, had shaken public confidence and raised questions about accountability. When institutions preach moral authority but fail to confront internal wrongdoing, he said, the damage extends far beyond individual victims. He also touched on family policy and population control. In regions struggling with poverty and limited resources, open discussion about family planning was often constrained by religious doctrine imported from elsewhere. The result, Traoré suggested, was not spiritual purity, but deepening hardship for the most vulnerable communities. Politically, he warned that religious influence had sometimes been used to legitimize leaders aligned with Western interests, discouraging resistance and framing obedience as virtue. The message, repeated subtly over decades, was endurance now and reward later. But for people facing hunger, violence, and inequality, justice deferred was justice denied. For American viewers, particularly those who value faith as a cornerstone of civic life, this section of the interview carried an uncomfortable resonance. The United States has its own history of wrestling with the intersection of religion and power. Civil rights leaders once challenged churches that preached patience while tolerating injustice. Traoré's critique echoed that tradition, though shaped by Africa's distinct experience. Throughout this segment, Tucker Carlson remained silent. He did not attempt to rebut or redirect. His silence was not disengagement, it was recognition. He appeared to understand that Traoré was not rejecting belief, but reclaiming it from institutions that had drifted from the people they claimed to serve. By the time Traoré finished outlining these civil and political consequences, the conversation had crossed a threshold. This was no longer about Africa alone, it was about how power, when cloaked in moral language, can shape societies without accountability. And for many watching across Africa, news networks and American screens alike, the question was no longer whether Ibrahim Traoré had gone too far. The question was whether the world had listened long enough. When Ibrahim Traoré finished outlining the civil and political consequences, the weight of his words did not remain confined to Burkina Faso or even to Africa. The implications traveled outward, across borders and belief systems, reaching directly into the American conscience. This was the moment when the conversation ceased to be regional and became global. For Americans over 40, faith is not an abstract concept. It is woven into family history, civic rituals, and national identity. Churches in the United States have served as centers of community, charity, and moral guidance. Yet American history also carries a parallel truth. Religion has, at times, been used to justify inequality, silence dissent, and protect power. Traoré's critique resonated because it mirrored a struggle Americans have lived through themselves. The United States civil rights movement did not reject Christianity. It challenged churches that preached obedience while tolerating injustice. Leaders once asked a similar question to American institutions of faith: does belief serve the people, or does it preserve the status quo? In this sense, Ibrahim Traoré was not speaking as an outsider attacking Western values. He was echoing a moral debate deeply familiar to American history. Tucker Carlson appeared to recognize this connection. His silence was not the silence of agreement, but of reflection. The discussion had moved beyond African news headlines and into shared ethical ground. The tension was no longer between Africa and the West, but between faith and power, wherever they coexist. Globally, reactions followed predictable fault lines. Some religious leaders condemned Traoré's remarks as divisive or dangerous. Others, including theologians and scholars in Africa and Europe, defended the distinction he made between Jesus Christ and institutional authority. They noted that criticism of structures does not equate to rejection of belief. In fact, such criticism has often emerged from within faith traditions themselves. In Burkina Faso, the response was equally complex. Many citizens expressed appreciation that their leader had voiced concerns they had long discussed privately. Others worried about international backlash, economic pressure, or misinterpretation by Western media. Traoré's words placed the country at the center of a sensitive global conversation, one that could not be easily walked back. Across Africa, especially among younger generations, the interview circulated rapidly. Social platforms and African news outlets debated whether Ibrahim Traoré represented a broader continental shift. Was this an isolated moment, or a sign that African leaders were beginning to speak more openly about cultural autonomy, spiritual dignity, and historical truth? For American viewers, the discomfort lingered. The interview challenged a common assumption that Western institutions, including religious ones, naturally carry moral authority abroad. Traoré did not deny the good done by churches. He questioned the right of any institution to operate without accountability in societies still healing from colonial wounds. As the broadcast ended, no definitive conclusions were offered. There was no applause, no closing argument, no declaration of victory. Instead, there was an unresolved tension, the kind that forces reflection rather than reaction. The question now faced viewers on both sides of the Atlantic. Do you think that President Ibrahim Traoré's national reform strategies are truly effective yet? Can faith remain sacred when it becomes entangled with political influence? And perhaps most unsettling of all, can the West listen without immediately defending itself? This was not a comfortable conversation, but it was a necessary one, and its impact would not be measured in ratings or headlines, but in the questions it left behind. What followed in the days after the broadcast surprised nearly everyone, including those who believed they had already understood the message. The twist did not come from Ibrahim Traoré changing his position, nor from Tucker Carlson issuing a dramatic response. It came from the reaction itself, quiet at first, then unmistakable. Across Burkina Faso, discussions began to take on a different tone. Religious leaders, community elders, teachers, and young activists started drawing a line that had long remained blurred. The line between faith as a source of moral strength and institutions as holders of unchecked authority. Traoré's words had not weakened belief. In many places, they had clarified it. Church gatherings did not empty. In some regions, they grew. But sermons began to change. Conversations shifted from obedience to responsibility, from waiting for salvation elsewhere to demanding justice here. This was not rebellion against God. It was a reclaiming of moral agency. Africa news outlets began reporting a rise in local theological forums, discussions that emphasized African context, African history, and African dignity within Christianity itself. Internationally, the reaction exposed an imbalance that had long gone unquestioned. Western commentators initially framed Traoré's remarks as risky, even provocative, but as transcripts circulated and full context became unavoidable, the narrative shifted. Analysts began to note that Ibrahim Traoré had not attacked Christianity. He had separated Jesus from empire. That distinction mattered. By refusing to collapse faith into institutional loyalty, Traoré unintentionally elevated his own standing. He was no longer viewed solely as a young military leader navigating post-colonial politics. He became, for many, a moral voice, not because he claimed religious authority, but because he refused to weaponize belief. In the United States, particularly among older Americans who had lived through the civil rights era, something familiar emerged. Letters to editors, radio call-ins, and church discussion groups referenced the interview. Comparisons were drawn to moments when American leaders had challenged churches to live up to their own teachings. The message resonated not as foreign criticism, but as moral reflection. This was the twist. The power dynamic shifted not against religion, but against those who had long assumed they spoke for it. Global institutions found themselves on uncertain ground. It is one thing to dismiss a political argument. It is far more difficult to dismiss a moral question asked calmly, publicly, and without malice. Ibrahim Traoré had not demanded allegiance. He had demanded accountability. And accountability is difficult to oppose without revealing discomfort. In Burkina Faso, this shift translated into political momentum. Traoré's broader reform agenda gained legitimacy, not because of force, but because of trust. Citizens who had remained skeptical of military leadership began to view him as something different. Not a ruler asking for patience, but a leader inviting responsibility. Africa news coverage increasingly framed Traoré as part of a continental reawakening, not a rejection of the world, but a renegotiation of terms. Faith, culture, and governance were no longer treated as imported frameworks, but as living realities shaped by African experience. Perhaps most unexpected was the reaction from within religious communities themselves. Some priests and pastors publicly agreed with Traoré's distinction. They spoke of faith stripped of hierarchy, belief grounded in service, and churches accountable to the people they serve. These voices, long present but rarely amplified, found space to speak. The twist, then, was not a reversal. It was an elevation. By challenging the misuse of faith, Ibrahim Traoré strengthened its meaning. By questioning power, he revealed where true authority does not reside. In that moment, he ceased to be merely a political figure in Burkina Faso. He became a symbol of something larger, a reminder that liberation does not always arrive through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives through clarity. And with that clarity came a final question, one that could not be confined to Africa or the West, but belonged to anyone who believes faith should uplift rather than control. By the time the conversation faded from the screen, something irreversible had already taken place. This was no longer about a single interview or a single leader, or even a single nation. It was about a principle that had waited generations to be spoken aloud. In Burkina Faso, the message settled quietly but firmly. Faith did not disappear. It matured. Communities began to speak with greater confidence, not against God, but against fear. Education was no longer framed as submission to outside authority, but as preparation for self-determination. People spoke of dignity, not as a future promise, but as a present right. African news outlets described it not as unrest, but as awakening. Ibrahim Traoré did not claim to be a prophet, and he did not ask to be followed blindly. He offered something far more demanding. He asked people to think, to separate belief from domination, to reclaim faith as a source of justice, courage, and responsibility. In his closing words, he left no ambiguity. "We do not ask permission to be free," Ibrahim Traoré said. "We stood up to take our freedom." For Americans watching, especially those who value faith, family, and truth, this was not a rejection of Christianity. It was a reminder of its core. That belief should lift the oppressed, not protect power. That Jesus stood with the poor, not above them. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré speaks to you, share this story. If you believe truth matters more than headlines, subscribe and stay with us. And if you believe Africa is no longer bowing, then perhaps you are witnessing history, not controversy. God bless Africa.